Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Becky Panetta, and I'm an agriculture conservation planner here at Marion Soil and Water Conservation District. We are pleased to welcome you today to our first Friday presentation. In the Marion SWCD, we have three main things that we do. We help advise our community, we help educate, and we love to engage our community in natural resource conservation. And so our presenter today is Beth Meyers-Shanai. She's been an invasive plant specialist with the Oregon Department of Agriculture's Noxious Weed Control Program for over 10 years. Her focuses are mapping, outreach, and managing and cooperating on high-priority noxious weed control projects around Northwest Oregon. She's a graduate of Oregon State University, where she studied natural resources, specializing in ecosystem management. She lives in Silverton with her husband and two of her daughters and enjoys exploring Oregon on foot, snowshoes, or bicycle.
Hi, I'm Beth Meyers-Shanai with the Oregon Department of Agriculture's Noxious Weed Program, and I'm joining you here at Minto Brown Park in Salem to teach you a little bit about aquatic noxious weeds. They're some of the most impactful weeds that we have on our entire noxious weed list because they grow so quickly and they're responding fairly fast to climate change. So they're growing even faster as we get warmer temperatures and warmer water. As you can see behind me here, we have a huge mass of what we call water primrose. Its name is Ludwigia hexapetala, botanical name. But it's really making a huge impact in this location at Minto Brown Park. And other noxious weeds, aquatic noxious weeds, can have very similar impacts as well. So first I just wanted to show you a little bit about what this plant looks like. There's a couple of different forms of the plant out here. I'm going to hold up one here that is a mature plant. And you can see a little bit of yellow. There's some flowers in this area behind me. I don't know if you can see in the shot further behind me, there's a lot of open yellow flowers. Since we're in the shade here, the yellow flowers are just waiting to open up in the sunshine. But once the plant matures, it gets these kind of long spear-shaped leaves. That's how you know it's rooted in the substrate and it's become established a little bit. But there's also, let me see, Heath, can you see one of the juvenile plants with the scoopy-shaped leaves there? I can bring these a little closer. When it's a juvenile plant, it has smaller kind of scoop-shaped leaves. So if it's just floating around, it can actually just stay alive floating in the water without needing its roots to be in the soil. And it'll stay in this form until it bumps up against something, maybe a log that's floating, or it gets bumped up against the edge of the shore, and then it stays still long enough, then it can root down and do this. And you can see these roots that have come off this little node here that are ready just to start a whole plant. So an incredible amount of strategies from this plant to be successful, which it is, which unfortunately is causing a lot of impacts to the water quality and habitat here in this spot and anywhere else that this plant gets started. In this location, in the past, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife had a fish monitoring trap where they would just trap one night, check the numbers of the fish, and release them the next day. But when they came to their trap, all the fish had died. And we suspect that it's because when you have this large amount of biomass in a water body, once it dies back at the end of the season, that takes a lot of oxygen out of the water. So plants produce oxygen, but when they decay, they create a lot of carbon dioxide and they take away the oxygen. So a large biomass like this in a water body is not good for fish. It also just actually takes up the physical space. There's less physical space for fish, there's less physical space for waterfowl, and also less physical space for recreation. So boaters and fishers in this area will have less of a chance of enjoying their time here if this water body closes over completely. the Ludwigia can actually form pretty dense mats that are dense enough for humans just to walk on. Even if it were over 10 feet of water and you had this huge mat of plants, it would support a person, and it has. We've had some crews who've worked on doing herbicide treatments of these plants who were able to actually walk out on top of the plants without any other surface below them because it gets so dense. Another one of the great strategies of this plant is what's called an erincomous root. So I'm going to go grab one of those to show you, because it actually, it creates this low oxygen condition, but it also creates its own way of exchanging gases up above the surface of the water, which is very unusual. That fish just swam by again. We do have some fish here. Let's see if I can get a piece. Yeah, I know, this is just, this whole thing wants to come up. You can see how much biomass there is already. There we go. And I'm gonna hand this, Heath, would you mind taking these? I might as well not put them back in, although it's probably not gonna make a big difference, but any of these fragments, like we were saying, could start another population. So these roots are really interesting and white and spongy. They just feel like little sponges. And when you're out there looking at the mass of the water primrose, you can just look down and see these little things just floating up at the top everywhere. Really gives them a strategy for surviving in really stagnant conditions that other plants eventually would just deplete all the resources and then die off. I've put a few fragments of Ludwigia in an aquarium to take to the state fair, and it just fills the whole thing up, and it will sit there all season long because of those interesting roots. This plant is actually native to South America. And so, yeah, it does feel like felt. And down there, it probably has developed all these strategies just to kind of eke itself out. And it would have other predators, some insects, maybe other animals that would feed on it. And so it wouldn't become a monoculture, which means just one type of plant growing, which is what happens here when it gets started. It's been in the area for a few decades. And so there are a lot of places, especially in the Willamette Valley, in little side channels and sloughs of the Willamette River in the central part of the Willamette Valley, where there's a lot of slow water, backwaters, quiet waters, and it really takes off and fills in there. Unfortunately, it's been a very difficult plant to control on a large scale because of that biomass and because it stores so much reserves in below the surface that even when you can do an herbicide treatment that gets to roots, it doesn't generally get everywhere. And it will come back when it's got a large hold on an area. The best way to control this plant is to find the places where it's not yet and get those little populations out before they become a big problem. Another way that we often tackle large-scale noxious weed problems like this is using biological control, which is finding the native insects or pathogens, taking them through a rigorous testing process that's usually a decade or two long to make sure they're safe in quarantine conditions, and then bringing them out. So there is some background going on right now. There hasn't been a lot of success in finding the right biocontrol agent, but that's one hope that we have, that we might be able to impact some of these areas where it's really settled in and get rid of it there. This one, as you can see, it has a pretty showy yellow flower. Let me bring one of the flowers up a little closer too. I didn't get one of these on the last pick, but it's got a pretty flower, and it has been brought here as an aquatic ornamental plant, people's ponds. They may have even thought it might be nice in their aquarium, but then they probably regretted that pretty quickly. Oftentimes when people get something that they don't like, they'll toss it out. They may dump it, or it might just overflow from their pond on a flood year and then get into an open water body. Once that happens, it can get caught on people's boat propellers. It can get caught just tangled up in wild waterfowls, legs, feet. and just move from place to place that way. Since it only needs a little fragment, it doesn't take much to get all of this started. So most of its reproduction is actually vegetative, which means it's just the plant reproducing itself and breaking off and reproducing elsewhere. I know it does go to seed, but I don't think that the seed viability is as responsible for the spread that we see here than the actual just vegetative spread.
So it doesn't spread by people boating through it?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be the seed spread, but if people boated through it and picked up any fragment of the plant on their paddle, if you were paddling and you fragmented a piece and then your paddle, got taken to another spot, this lake probably is a little higher, but this plant is perfectly happily growing in pretty dry conditions for a while. It wouldn't survive there permanently, but it can survive a pretty prolonged dry spell. And these are pretty much all juvenile plants up here. They're not super vigorous, but they'll just hold on there. And if you dug this out and took it someplace else moist, it would take off very happily. Heath also brought me over a couple of samples that I keep in my greenhouse for ID purposes. And you can see mostly this one in this pot, it's presenting still kind of in its juvenile form with these more rounded leaves versus these spear-shaped leaves. These are the matures, and those are the juvenile leaves. And so you might not even realize that this is the same plant. If you saw this plant growing with its yellow flowers everywhere, but you came across this paddling in a new little spot, you might not know for sure. And there are native Ludwigias. And in this pot, I have the native. Would you be able to come hold one, Heath? And I can show one of the key differences. You can just generally tell this more robust. This has this reddish stem, and it's nowhere near as robust of a grower. But the kicker is that the leaves on this one that are right across from each other on the stem, we call that opposite leaves because there's one leaf right opposite the other. On this plant, they're alternate. So you have a leaf, you go down about 1/2 inch, and then the next leaf comes out. So they're alternating on the stem. That's the non-native invasive one, and the native one is the opposite leaved one. So you don't have to worry if you're finding the native. It's doing its job. It won't, this one will likely choke out this one, shade it out, completely cover it if they get into the same area. But you may see them growing in a similar location. Yeah, Heath was asking if it needs still water, and it does need very slow moving or still water to do that taking root part. So it definitely, moving water will carry it to other places, but it won't settle in and thrive very easily. It doesn't take much of a slow, a rock or two sticking out, it could start a little bit, but for a mass infestation like this one, it really needs the slow moving water. If you're canoeing in the mid-Willamette especially, there's even been some, picked up on some of our feeder rivers into the Willamette. The Santiam River has some ponds and streams in that area as well. Yeah, it's very likely. We do have a place where you can report new infestations. It's called the Oregon Invasives Hotline. And you can call them at 1-866-INVADER, or even better, you can go to the Oregon Invasives Hotline, all one word, .org. And you can report something that you found there, especially if you think it's a new infestation that's just starting. And we can make sure that a local weed professional, or if it's in my region, it might be something I can come see if we can get it cleared out before it becomes too big of a deal. Some of the other, I'm going to go show you another plant that happens to be in this location because it's another pretty common one. It can be very aggressive, but actually less aggressive than this plant. That's why it's kind of just interspersed in here. So let me wade in one more time. And I'm going to pull out what's called parrot's feather. I'm going to get some of the underground and as well as the above ground material. So this one just kind of looks like little evergreen trees, baby evergreen trees sticking up out of the water, but a very feathery leaf that sticks up, and then lots of robust growth underground as well. So if you're in an area where you see a lot of little things that look like trees sticking up out of the water, you've come across a parrot feather patch, which is another noxious weed. pretty aggressive. Also a great idea to stop it when it's first getting started. One of the things we've noticed at some of the areas where some large-scale water primrose treatment has been attempted is the next thing that comes in is often the parrot's feather. So it's kind of been down there and then, kind of trying to hang in there, and then the space opens up and then you've got another one to deal with, which is another reason why these aquatic weeds are such complex plants to manage effectively and try to reclaim water bodies for their intended uses of habitat and recreation and general water quality improvement. They're tough to deal with, but it's always good to recognize when you know you've got it, especially if you're managing a small pond on your own property. You probably have a great chance to really make an impact and maybe find out a little bit more about what your area's habitat is good for. When you have a large-scale problem like this one, it's impossible to say we're going to go out and eradicate water primrose from the Willamette Valley or from the Willamette River. But you can choose a particular backwater or slough that's the known, let's say, Oregon chub habitat, which recently got taken off the endangered species list. You'd hate to have one of their ponds all of a sudden be taken over by this plant. So you may focus your efforts on places that are particularly sensitive for a particular species or a particular set of species habitats. Here's a map of where we were standing. This little fishing icon is the little spot where we were. So relative to this whole area, we could see that Ludwigia just impacting all of these sides. And when we get down to this area, we're going to find a little spot, a bigger spot of parrot feathers. So we're going to be taking a walk here to go get some footage of that. But also you can see in this inset map a little bit more of how this hydrology or the way the water works in this area. This actually can connect during really high flow areas, even this little bit of an oxbow here. So this is how Ludwigia can easily just keep moving and during a high flow get picked up and scoured out. Okay, so now we're standing at the other end of the slough that we were standing at before in the Ludwigia, or the water primrose. But at this end, there is a pretty healthy patch of just the parrot's feather that he has the camera pointed at now. So you can kind of get an idea of what a bunch of that parrot's feather, those little tree-like structures sticking out of the water are. And in fact, if you zoom, I don't know if you can do this, Heath, but while you're looking at this edge of where the water primrose is, you can see the Ludwigia interspersed with all of it. So they're both pretty aggressive and competitive, but the water primrose is definitely growing taller and probably shading out a lot of the potential of the parrot's feather here, but it's still managing to hold on right there near the shore. And I don't know if there's a way to, like, you can kind of get a better perspective of how much this whole slough that we were standing at the other end of is infested here too. It's really closing off right into the middle, and because Ludwigia grows so well free floating, it can root into the substrate pretty far beneath it, but it can also use the roots that are rooted in closer to the shore and just keep its biomass growing closer and closing up the middle. So a lot of impacts from aquatic noxious weeds here. One of the plants that I unfortunately didn't get a sample to bring you today that's also really high on our radar, we have a listing process at the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and the Oregon State Weed Board decides upon getting a recommendation from staff whether to add a plant to the noxious weed list. So many plants are invasive, but they only get added to a noxious weed list after going through a matrix where you evaluate the impacts that it has. And we have A-listed species, which are the highest priority in the state, and we actually do go after those to completely eradicate or contain them. And then we have B-listed species, which we know are probably not able to eradicate, but we note their importance and we make sure they're quarantined so people can't move them around or sell them in nurseries. So all of our listed noxious weeds have those backstops to them, that they're regulated. And this one, the parrot's feather and the water primrose, are B-listed species. We do have the B-listed water primrose as a target. So it's one that, even though it's a B, we still pay a little bit more attention to, especially in those early detection places. But those A-listed species are the top priority. And we're actually working on another A-listed aquatic in the Willamette River called yellow floating heart. A tiny little lily pad looking leaf, but it's much smaller than a regular lily pad. It's only 2 or 3 inches across. Also has a yellow flower that's kind of similar to this. I think its petals stick out, have a little more frill around the edges, and they tend to stick up above the surface where all of the leaves of the yellow floating heart are. So you'd see something kind of similar to this, about that same height even, but then you'd see these tiny little heart-shaped lily pads floating around. That one grows extremely fast, a little less biomass, but it can cover across an area very quickly. So yellow floating heart is another one that if you see something suspicious with little tiny lily pads and yellow flowers, that'd be a great one to use that 1-866 invader or the OregonInvasivesHotline.org to log where you found it, and that one will get a very rapid response. Yeah, we actually, it was discovered, we have a great partner called Willamette Riverkeeper, if you haven't heard of them. They do a lot of great work improving all the stretch of the Willamette River for recreation, for wildlife, and one of their groups was surveying and found a large population of yellow floating heart up near Eugene in a side slough, about 3 acres of it. There had been some small reports of it along the river prior to that, and now we get an understanding of how that happened. It looks like an ornamental population in that slough. If it was someone who had it in a pond, we don't know how it first started there. But now that we've started to get a handle on that large population and still making sure we look for the smaller ones that may have gotten started, we're doing pretty well in the Willamette River with yellow floating heart now. We're really hopeful. And this season there's been a 3-part project to cover over 100 miles of river, looking for any extra yellow floating heart and then addressing the ones that have already been found. So very comprehensive. A couple of other aquatics, they're more riparian area. They don't necessarily grow free floating out in the water like the water primrose and the parrot's feather can do, at least at the beginning. Purple loosestrife, which you may have heard of. It's an invasive all over the nation in many places with wetland habitats, riparian habitats, but that is one. We have a very successful biological control. Most of it in the Willamette Valley is being controlled very well, so you only see a few plants, a little clump here, a little clump there. You probably will see it if you're paddling the Willamette, but you probably won't see anything like this in size. But in some coastal areas or where there's a lot of tidal fluctuation or water fluctuation, it's a little harder for that agent to get established. So there still are some places in Oregon where you'd see purple loosestrife. So, Chelsea just saw one at Kaiser Rapids Park, a purple loosestrife bush. Was it right at the edge of the river there, or like in a? Okay, so up on the bank a little bit. It's also fun to look for the agents. There's golden beetles that are not really super tiny, maybe a 1/4 inch or so. So if you see these little beetles and a lot of chewed on leaves, you might have seen the biological control agent for that one.
What should you do if you see a purple loosestrife? Should you pull it out?
Yeah, it's not really necessary if it seems like it's not spreading. You can. It's really not harmful to take it. You're not going to impact the population of the biological control agents if you take that one plant out. But it's probably also not going to spread an impact because those beetles have dispersed themselves. That's what's nice about the biological control agents is most of them don't need a lot of work after you get them started. They kind of build up in an area, then they start moving on looking for more food in other places, and that's how they spread themselves out. But we do have another aquatic that's on our A list, and we're actually looking for that on the Willamette because it was found in one location by an astute kayaker who put it on the OregonInvasivesHotline.org website, and they found garden yellow loosestrife, which is actually a little bit different species than the purple one, but it also has a tall, it's kind of a shrubby, riparian-loving plant that has a cluster of yellow flowers at the top. There's an ornamental relative that has some flowers along the edges of the stalk you'd see some flowers kind of tucked in among the leaves. That one is fine. It's not the invasive, but if you come across one that has a lot of flowers right at the top, even if you're not sure what it is, it's fine to put it on the hotline just in case, because it's going to be seen by a weed professional who can ID it and say, oh no, that's a native, or that one's fine. I mentioned the website is great because you can pin a spot on a map exactly where you were, and you can upload a photo so that other people can see. And you can interact with the weed professionals a little bit more to give them more information, or they can check back with you to ask more questions. So that's a great reason. So we're because of that one report, we were able to fund an organization through our Oregon State Weed Board grants, the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District, to expand surveying, and they did find some more upstream of the original site. We're still not 100% sure where that one came from or where it started, but it likely was an ornamental that was grown at a property near the river and then started to spread downstream. Yes. Japanese, Bohemian, giant knotweeds, those are all common, not really running rampant around Marion County, but they are here. They're riparian plants. They don't grow out in open water, but they love the edges. And that is something that the Marion Soil and Water Conservation District staff can help you with some ideas if you know of a patch and you want to get on top of it. It's a little more common. It's one of our bee weeds. It's one that we don't do a lot of grant funding for yet, although we have, when we've had some coalitions of groups come together to do some larger scale, like we have 5 different watersheds that kind of came together to work on it. That kind of comprehensive action on it we felt was very effective, so we did do fund some grants for it there. But that one is actually very responsive to treatment and isn't too hard to get on top of it. When we have very large populations of it, in the coast especially, we do have a biological control agent that has just started to be released. It's been approved for release. Now we're waiting to see if that insect likes to live here and will really want to establish here and make a large impact. So that work is still ongoing to see if we can get it established. Yes, if you have Japanese knotweed, don't mow it or cut it. It's all that disturbance really encourages the underground growth, and it has a very hardy rhizome system that has a lot of energy in it. So any cutting will make it go out and spread the patch bigger rather than starve it out or control it. So it really does need an herbicide treatment to be effective if you have any amount of it at all. And generally doing those treatments in starting about mid this month through mid-September is the perfect range. It has a really beautiful flower that attracts a lot of pollinators, and so generally if I'm working on controlling Japanese knotweed, I wait until after the flowers senesce. The sprays that we have are not toxic to insects, but I want to make sure they are able to do what they're doing without disturbing them as much as possible. And so I usually wait until just after the flowers go. You want to make sure you get it before the leaves start to turn yellow, because then all the energy is already going back down into the roots, or has gone, and you won't get any movement of the herbicide down there if you're too late. Yes. Yeah, in general, when there are a lot of really beneficial insects that depend on the inputs of this organic matter into the stream, but they depend on a variety of diet, not just one thing, just like we depend on a variety of foods to get our whole nutritional complex. So if you have this water primrose or Japanese knotweed, the only thing growing on the stream side, then there's only one food, and you're probably going to lose your diversity of insects as much as you've lost the diversity of the plants along the water.
But what impacts does it have on water quality?
Well, yeah, we touched a little bit on the lack of oxygen. I think I'm going to have to punt this one. There's been some great studies of water quality, and dissolved oxygen was one of the key indicators in the areas that have a lot of water primrose. Dissolved oxygen went way down. And there probably were some other bits of impacts like pH, but I'd have to go back to the study to remember it. But I do know for sure that they documented very low levels of dissolved oxygen over the season especially. So as you get towards the end of the season and the plant material starts to decay, die off, at the top anyway, the roots are fine, it takes a lot of oxygen out. one of the other things that they studied was the assemblages of plant communities. So they also documented in a paired study that definitely diversity of plant material also went down. Yes, yes. Thanks, Heath. Heath was talking about the Wapato. There's some at the back of this slough here. It's an arrow, big arrow leaf that's also a wetland plant, and it's a very important cultural to Native Americans that are in this region. It has an edible tuber and was a very important in the past and current staple in their diet. And when the Ludwigia comes in, it really suppresses it. I am sure that if there were a way to effectively remove a lot of this Ludwigia there, you would see a resurgence of the Wapato. And that's what I've seen on my paddles of the Willamette doing work, is that where there's been a small bit of Ludwigia getting started and then it's removed, the Wapato has come right in very quickly and filled those areas in. So one of the big networks in this region, it's called the Willamette Aquatic Invasive Network. There's just a lot of people who have the same goal on managing aquatics in this whole region, coming together to share their successes and you know, put some strategies together. They actually called their effort Wapato Revival because it is such an obvious impact to that important plant, both for the habitat and the cultural. Well, yeah, we generally, it would have been part of that matrix when we first listed it. It would have been impacts to endangered species, whether they're other plants or animals, are part of the way that we score things out. And it definitely would have increased its level in listing it as a noxious weed. And definitely these types of waters, that water primrose and parrot feather and yellow floating heart, they're all these shallow backwaters that are very important rearing areas for juvenile salmon and steelhead, or what we call salmonids. So yeah, it's very impactful when you have a normal area that would be a quiet area for them to swim around and feed, and then maybe they're feeding on those insects where the diversity went down because the feed went down, and it's a web, it's a complex chain. And when you mess with this primary production of plant material, it really affects things all the way on up. So it definitely could have an impact to salmon as well.
All right. That was such a great presentation. Thank you, Beth. And thank you for joining us for the Q&A session.
You bet. Could you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
That's great.
Okay, we do have some questions here, so I'll go ahead and get started. Question number 1, how do government entities work with ODA and weed management groups to handle their smaller infestations of water primrose and other emerging invasive species? And along with that, are there priority treatment areas along the Willamette River?
We definitely do work with local agencies. We don't actually work directly on the plant populations much unless there's some early detection and we can make it out there and maybe help. But we do a lot of consultation, helping people craft effective strategies if they want to do some work. And then when there's a large group who has worked through, what we think might be a really effective project, there are also Oregon State Weed Board grants to apply for. And all of the specialists work really closely with groups that are crafting a grant project to help them craft the strongest competitive grant possible. So those are all ways. So looking up the local person, I'm in the Northwest Oregon, kind of just north of Marion County, over to the coast, over to the Cascades. So, and then my colleague Grant Jackson has from Marion County south through Lane County and over to the coast and mountains as well. And I'm sure we can get folks connected with the right specialist if they just call our main ODA noxious weed program line. And we're more than happy to work and help people craft plans.
Thank you. Our next question, is milfoil an invasive water weed?
Yeah, we have Eurasian water milfoil is an invasive, and it's on our noxious weed list as a B. And actually the parrot feather is a type of milfoil also. It's just another species of it. Yeah.
Right. Next up, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of tools and strategies used to manage aquatic invasives and the philosophy of integrated pest management?
Um, wow, that's a big that's a big one. Yeah, absolutely. We have a whole slate of what we call tools in our toolbox. So even though we know herbicides are very effective on plants, we have kind of a system of how big is the infestation? Can you manage it manually? Is there a time of the year that's better to treat it so that you don't waste herbicide on an ineffective treatment? For example, Japanese knotweed. We've learned that treating it in the spring, even though the growth is coming up and it's vigorous, it's not utilizing the plant's ability to pull resources down into its roots like it does in the fall when it's getting ready to go dormant. So the timing is really important. So we look at all of these different, what methods can we use that are the least impactful? What timing can we use that's the most impactful? All of those are parts of the integrated pest management process. And so knowing the biology of the plant is really important. What's its life cycle? When is it flowering? When is it seeding? When is it bringing energy into its roots? So you have to know each individual pest really well to answer those kinds of questions and have really effective management of it. And I realized there was a part of an earlier question that I forgot to mention, which was about priority areas on the Willamette. And that actually was addressed by that Wapato revival plan. So I would recommend going to that website because there was an evaluation of the whole area with known populations of important species to help prioritize and focus where some of the treatments on the water primrose especially would be most effective.
Great. Next up, are there resources for home pond and water garden for plants to use?
Resources as in help understanding control or I can say while you're looking for a follow-up there that homeowners, we can definitely consult with them, but if they need help with the control and they're not comfortable doing it themselves, there are landscape and contractors that can come do, private contractors that can come do treatments.
Okay. We did get a follow-up on that. Let's see. Keith also just put a link as a resource in there, but that follow-up was what is safe to use. So maybe what plants would be safe.
Yeah, okay. Oh, what plants would be safe for landscaping or?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything that's native, I think that's probably best answered by your local conservationist at your local soil and water conservation districts. They are really experts at what thrives well in what conditions as far as healthy native populations. And having a healthy native population can really hedge sometimes against the infestation of aquatics. Some aquatics are so aggressive they will take over the natives, but in some areas, especially terrestrial areas, weeds generally take over the bare spots, the things that have been left without other plant cover. So maintaining healthy populations is important. If you're talking about an aquatic system, once you get some good natives established, you have to really keep an eye out for those invasives and stop them early to maintain the healthy system that you're trying to achieve.
Okay, we do have one question left in the chat. So those of you who are attending, if you have any questions, now would be the time to get them in the chat. But our last question so far, can water weeds like milfoil inhibit flow?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because what they do is the little bit of flow that's there to begin with, those plants, some of the milfoils and another similar one called Elodia or Ageria densa, it's called South American waterweed. They actually can handle a little bit more flow, but they can trap little fine sediments that come down. And when they trap them, they kind of drop to the bottom and create more and more muck, which can create more plant growth, which can slow the water down even more. So anytime you have water weeds and water's coming through, it's all of the surfaces of that plant are going to slow and stop the water just a little bit. So it definitely can fill in with sediment. And sometimes, you can almost dry up an area after a while or make it kind of muddy and mucky instead of open free flowing water.
Well, it looks like that was our last question. So Beth, thank you again for
Right.
joining us and doing that pre-recording earlier in the week. It was really a great informational video to see. And